The question today is is the class system back, and is it getting stronger? So my panellists are in order. Judith Sloan, who's a contributing economics editor to The Australian. She's held numerous commercial directorships and has served as a commissioner on the Productivity Commission and the Commissioner for the Australian Fair Pay Commission. Welcome to Judith.
Thank you very much.
Sitting next to Judith is Mark Carnegie. He's the Managing Director of MH Carnegie & Co. and has over 30 years of experience as an entrepreneur, investor and corporate advisor. Welcome to Mark. And our other Mark on the far left is an Australian writer, essayist and former politician. He's the author of Not Dead Yet, Australia's Post-Left Future, and the now out in bookstores and can be bought after this session, his book, The Political Bubble, Why Australians Don't Trust Politics. Welcome to Mark. Now, a couple of months ago, novelist Tim Winton wrote an essay on class in the Monthly, and he made the following comment. Anyone reckless enough to declare class a live issue is likely to be met with howls of derision. Any mention of structural social inequality is tantamount to a declaration of class warfare. Concerns about the distribution of wealth, education and health are difficult to raise in a public forum without needing to beat off the ghost of Stalin. I wanted to ask, so are we beating off the ghosts of Stalin today? I'm interested in getting every panel member to respond to that, and I might start with you, Judith.
Well, actually, I think I fundamentally disagree with Tim Winton in the sense that I think that the issue of inequality, income inequality, and also the issue of equality of opportunity is a live debate. And I don't think people are scared off talking about it. I think the thing is that I don't particularly like the framework of class. I think the thing is that at any point in time, obviously, you know, the income distribution is distributed in a particular way, and there are people up the top and people in the middle and people down the bottom. The really interesting issue is social mobility and whether people can come from, you know, the bottom 20% of the income distribution to the top or the second top and the like. So I'd like to frame this debate in terms of what are the factors that encourage social mobility and what are the factors that impede it.
Mark Carnegie, what's your view? Do you think that class is something that, you know, should be left in textbooks from the 1970s, or do you think that we can still talk about issues of...
No, I mean, I think class gets you a headline out there in the world at the moment, and discussion about equality of opportunity doesn't. And so we end up in a situation where that's the way to get the headline. You claim that somebody's engaged in class warfare, that gets you a headline. The idea that we're going to somehow reintroduce the class system in Australia or find it emerge, that's a headline. But the real issue in terms of the functioning of the economy is the ladders of opportunity that Mark talks about, and making sure that those are functional and that a couple of steps on the ladder don't rust, or a couple of steps on the ladder don't get knocked out by somebody making a mess of an education system.
Mark Latham, I recall when you were leader of the opposition, some of the times you would suggest a policy change. So, for example, in terms of funding to education, it was described as class warfare. What's your view about our ability to discuss about class, or the relevance of class language anymore in politics?
Well, in the political system, accusing someone of class warfare is just a tactic to scare people and make them think that other groups will be subject to funding redistribution and the like. So I think the political tactic is one thing, but I've always thought that Australia is a class-structured society, and that in the 70s we had ruling class, middle class, working class, but the success of the economic program and reforms in the 80s and 90s mean that we've still got a remnant ruling class, not as powerful as they used to be because of the really big change, and that is the expansion of the Australian middle class, massive increase in income levels and wealth, better educated society, more self-reliant people, which is a very, very positive development, not only for them but the country. And what we've seen is the disappearance of what used to be known as the Australian working class, and at the bottom of society now it's more an underclass, people who aren't working, and for 2 or 3, maybe 4 generations, no one in the family's had a job. And the issues of disadvantage go beyond finance and economics into a whole set of social norms and social values. So I think of society now as a less powerful ruling class, a much expanded middle class, and 10% underclass, people who've missed out on the benefits of globalisation.
I want to talk about this, this expanded middle class. In the research I do as a social researcher, pretty much everybody describes themselves as middle class, but of course that can vary hugely in terms of you know, their income, their employment profile, their ability to be able to do things basically like fund their retirement. Has that expansion of the middle class and people's identification with it, is that in itself a problem? Does it kind of mean that we can't talk effectively about social inequality because everybody considers themselves to be middle class?
No, you can talk about it, but you've got to talk about it in a realistic fashion. When out in the southwest of Sydney where I live, gyp rockers are earning $150,000 a year, electricians are doing about the same, and you read of coal miners in the Hunter Valley, well up in the 100,000 per annum. You're not talking of traditional working class here. People can hold those values and they probably talk the same about football and family and life, but their economic reality has changed so dramatically, and with the deregulation of the finance system, people have got better access to capital. With that sort of money behind them, earning capacity, they can set up their own small business, most of them have, and you've got a different set of economic values and aspirations. We can talk about that, but I think we're essentially talking about an Australian success story, but you've got to talk about it in a fashion that is real. It's no good sticking to the old dogma of left or right. There's a new Australia out there that needs to be understood and described.
Judith, what's your response to Mark's characterisation there?
Well, I guess it doesn't kind of make good theatre that we seem to be in heated agreement at this point, but maybe it'll move along to a bit of dispute. But I mean, I think the thing is partly what you're saying is that, you know, the old manufacturing model and the like, it actually generated quite a lot of low skill, you know, relatively low income, but regulated wage income, and that pretty much has disappeared. So the return is to skills, the return is to effort, and the return is, of course, to a bit of luck, you know, because you can be in segments which have prospered greatly, and so people have done quite well. I think, you know, and maybe this is a bit more controversial, I think there's a lot of discussion about the top 1%. And not enough
What kind of discussion about the top?
Well, particularly overseas, and we've had
overseas,
you know, Piketty's working. I mean, you know, I'm a kind of facts and figures kind of girl, and you know, the interesting thing is that by international comparisons, Australia looks like a pretty equal place. So, you know, for example, the top 1% of income earners account for about 7.5% of total income. In America, that's 20%. You know, that's like a really big difference.
Do you think there's been as much discussion in Australia about the top 1%? It's been very politicized. It's been very talked about in, for example, the United States in the wake of the GFC. But do we talk about it as much?
Well, I hope we don't.
Here?
And you know, I was talking to Mark Carnegie about this. So I had a look at the top 200 richest people. You know, the magazine puts that list out every year. And less than a third of those people actually come from wealthy backgrounds, come from wealthy families. And of course, you will know people from wealthy backgrounds who don't do well and don't stay rich, I might add. So the idea, which was partly Piketty's idea, that wealth begets wealth, and if you're not wealthy in the first instance, forget it. That doesn't seem to be true in Australia.
Okay, I do want to get back to that idea about Australia being reasonably egalitarian compared to international standards, but I want to ask Mark Carnegie this question. This was quite, you know, this got a lot of media when he said it. Warren Buffett recently said, actually, there's been class warfare going on for the last 20 years and my class has won.
Well,
and he went on really to talk about the dramatic reduction of tax rates, of the disparity between, the very wealthy and even the well-off in America, the kind of shrinking of the middle class and the growth of what's described as the working poor. Now, of course, that's America, that's not here, but I was interested to get your response to that.
So, well, I think two things. Australia refuses to ever look at itself on the basis that it's done anything better than the rest of the world. And yet, if you look at, in a boxing sense, the difference between Australia having a left-right combination from the early 1980s and Britain and the US having what was essentially a right-left combination, we've ended up with a completely different structure in terms of the regulatory reform agenda as a consequence of the policy settings being set by the left in Hawke Keating and then finding the right combination with the Howard Battlers and all of that coming in, compared to Thatcher and Reagan and then finding Blair and Clinton. It's just set us up differently to that. I think the danger in terms of the warrant, and the second thing is that the obscenity of the carried interest deduction in the US, the idea that, as Buffett talks about, rich people can end up paying 15% tax in the United States, and because they're able to essentially claim their ordinary income is on capital account, is just ridiculous. But the part that I think we haven't had as a nation a sensible conversation about, and I still can't understand this, which is, explain to me what the structural rationale is for concessionary rates of tax on capital as opposed to income. It's illogical. When you look at profit share of GDP being at unprecedented rates for capital, why is it that the society wants to do that? I don't get it. I don't get how the average working man and woman who's paying 50% marginal rate on their overtime sits there and says, absolutely, I'm going to make that deal. I can understand it when we didn't have capital and stuff like that, but I can't understand how that's a sane thing now.
Judith, what's your response to that?
Well, of course, when we don't want to get too technical here, because, of course, it's probably better not to have any tax on capital at all, as the truth be known, because effectively it all ends up, being borne by some other party. But look, I guess the general point is this, and I think that really is true in America, but there are issues here, that there are all sorts of anomalies in the tax and indeed the transfer arrangements, which sort of shoot off all sorts of funny implications. So some people get obscenely wealthy. I mean, the audience may not agree with me, but I'm happy for someone to get wealthy through hard work, entrepreneurship, risk-taking, education and training. That's fine by me. That's the kind of society we want. I don't want people to get wealthy through monopolies, through racketeering, through rent seeking, through working regulations or working tax codes to their advantage. So that's, I think, a really important part of the discussion. So it's how people become rich. It's how people, get themselves out of a sticky situation and improve their lot. That's really interesting. And there are definitely some ways which are very unsatisfactory from society's point of view, and a lot of them are the fault of policymakers.
But Mark, I'm sorry, but Judith, do you see any of the very wealthy in Australia? Would you say that all of them have achieved their levels of success through this great hard work ethic and entrepreneurism? Can you single out anybody?
Well, you've got to say Twiggy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Twiggy first, yep.
Yeah.
Well, I go back to the point,
Look at the guys
a lot of them haven't started with wealth themselves.
Cannon Brooks and all of those guys that, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the ones I've got in the gun, and you may not agree with me, are the people in the financial services industry who I think are basically, high rent feeders who are essentially intermediates in the economy. So I'm really interested in people who really do things and invest and create new enterprises. Financial services leaves me a bit cold.
And I think also having socialised the losses and subsidise the sector as extraordinarily as people have. I mean, I think this is exactly the problem about class, which is when you get a group of people, and I know we've got to jump to Mark, to this discussion.
Mark will jump in any moment, I can feel it.
The problem you've got here is you very quickly come to debates about tax policy, right? And that's the moment where everyone goes to sleep and starts watching everything else. And so fundamental debates about the tax on capital versus income, which I would have with Judith, profoundly, just bore people. It's the same as the tax summit and all of that.
But that being said, even though they might be across the detail, I'm telling you in the research we find there is a perception that the tax system isn't necessarily one in which you know, people who are working hard are rewarded.
Yeah, but
who are in the middle
hold on
and
a second.
Class.
They went and voted against the mining tax, right?
Well,
any sort of restructuring of the GST wasn't even within the framework of the Henry Tax Commission. Any discussion about land tax or any of the things that you could have done to rationalise it, any of that conversation, the answer was, if you sit there and go and tell people, cut the debt, axe the tax, that's what gets you home. So whatever they said, that wasn't the way they voted.
Well, we could go on about, because that's about the reasons why that last election was lost, but Mark's being uncharacteristically quiet. I would like to get you to respond, perhaps not to the, I mean, interesting to the Buffett comment about whether you think that relates to Australia at all, but to what Judith and Mark have said about the tax system.
Well, on the Buffett comment, I don't think there's evidence in Australia that the ruling class have won, in that we've had this massive expansion of middle class opportunity, and I suppose from my point of view in assessing the quality of society, I'm more interested in the people who are permanently missing out on decent opportunities than those who might notionally be at the top of the income tree. Because it's also true that money doesn't necessarily give you the good life. I was struck recently by James Packer's comments that he's had enormous financial success in recent times, but his private life is crap, or worse to that effect.
He's still got Miranda Kerr to like him. I mean, I'm really not that sorry for him in the scheme of things.
Are we sure
well,
about that?
Well, there's more to life than money, and a successful life and happiness is founded on personal relationships and love and family and support and a lot of things that go beyond economics. And you'd have to judge that Australia, as a society, is a lot stronger and more successful on all fronts than it was 30 years ago. What worries me most is the unique Australian circumstance of a fairly significant 10% underclass who are locked in permanent poverty. Why are we unique? Well, we've done two things that you won't find in Europe. One is the dispossession of Indigenous Australians and the whole process of disadvantage there. And the other thing we did that was such a poor government decision in the 60s and 70s was constructing broadacre public housing estates on the outskirts of our cities, whether you're talking about Western Sydney or places like Elizabeth in Judith's hometown of Adelaide. Those manufacturing jobs, the original idea was broadacre public housing to service manufacturing plants. A lot of those plants have closed down or shed labour because of economic change, but the housing stock is there without jobs that have passed from generation to generation. You've got an entrenchment of disadvantage in Australia that for the bottom 10% still makes us a fundamentally unfair society. And the sadness, rhetoric about the fair go and Australia's reputation of egalitarianism, we don't have enough political focus or national debate about this slow-burning crisis of underclass.
I was going to ask you that because, I mean, the Australian Labor Party has long been the champion of the working class. Have they failed this underclass to be an effective
this is an interesting issue
for them?
There is no working class left in Australia, and it's an identity and purpose question for the ALP, in that, dominated in many cases by union-sponsored factionalism. They're living on a memory of a large, viable working class population in this country that we haven't got now in substance, and the real equity issues are people who don't belong to trade unions. In fact, they haven't got a job. They don't go to political meetings. They don't belong to Eddie Obeid's faction or Ian McDonald's faction in the Labor Party. They're third and fourth generation unemployed, welfare dependent people, either in Indigenous communities where there are no jobs, or in outer suburban areas where that type of work that their grandparents had relied on has disappeared. So that's the big equity issue. And unfortunately, in Labor's organisational structure, it's not something that's front and centre.
Mark Carnegie, your view about this, you know, this entrenched underclass and what to do about it. They're not, you know, then it's probably an unattractive or difficult thing as a politician to be their champion. I mean, what do you think can be done? Well, and what do you think the role necessarily of the top 1% should be in relation to that bottom 10%?
Well, so the problem is there are votes in discussions about rights. There are no votes in discussions about obligations and engagement. So when you try and figure out how to start dealing with those incredibly, incredibly difficult cycles of dependency and sociological cascades and all of those things, when you talk to the people who are actually engaged, you have a horrendous on-the-ground problem about invading people's rights to get an economic outcome. So if you talk to Noel Pearson about what it actually takes to get 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids to be able to read and write, he's got the answer. Everyone's got the answer in terms of what you teach them in the school. But the question is, are you going to let what is essentially a white person in almost all circumstances trespass in the house of the parents to actually get the kid out of the house and to school in the morning? Now, what politician possibly wants to talk about that? What politician wants to talk about the fact that for a whole group of people, the truth is the father takes all the welfare and drinks it or spends it, you know, at the tab before it ever gets? Who wants to actually sit there and say income management is absolutely central to getting people out of these cycles of dependency? Who wants to talk about anything to do with making sure that you stop at 3 kids in those things? Any of those discussions have to be kryptonite for anybody who's trying to get elected, or anybody who's a rich, entitled white prick as well. You know, it's just...
What, like you?
Yeah, like me. You know, it's why I don't want to go anywhere near it, because what do you do at the top? You know, you look at Twiggy and the whole income management, and the answer is you can't deal with it. So somebody's got to figure out what to do. And then you go and look at the people who sort of cluster around those communities, the broken, parasitic white people who find some way to sort of take a huge amount of the money that the rest of society finds to try and deal with this. We can't have a national, open and honest debate about it, because any of the solutions are just completely politically unacceptable.
But where are the jobs? I mean, I hear the rhetoric from Noel Pearson and others about teaching the 8- and 9-year-olds how to read and write. Fantastic. I hope it happens. And the rhetoric about income management,
so
for getting
$2 million bucks. Hold on, I tell you, right? So it's really, really hard. We're putting $2 million bucks into a timber mill up there. It's going to produce a fraction of the jobs of anything that you could see, but there will be 8 jobs to start, and maybe there's 200 or something like that. But you know what's going to happen there if you actually try and make a timber industry competitive, right? Even when you've got free capital or any of those things, the regulatory constraints on it and the occupational health and safety and all of this other crap of regulation that you guys have hung around everybody's neck make it absolutely impossible to go and do it. There's tons of jobs up there if you could find some way to reduce the regulatory burden.
Well, I don't know about that. I've visited remote Indigenous communities and always walked away thinking Bill Gates couldn't turn a dollar here. There's just nothing. And the truth of Australia's economic success story.
Well, you go and look at, out of Weipa, with Rio reclaiming the land from the bauxite mine, you could find some way to build a perfectly effective palm oil competitive palm oil business up there. Yes, it'd have 1/100th of the jobs that the palm oil business would have in Indonesia, but you could have a functioning thing up there if you didn't have all the regulatory burden.
Yeah, but Mark, we keep hearing the promise of all these jobs and...
Mate, it's hard, mate. I know what's your solution, mate? I mean, you've identified we're down to the 10%.
Well, my solution is to finish my sentence in the first instance.
Needs a bit of help.
And then to point out that I visited Noel Pearson's community there. He had 20 jobs in the Mossman Gorge Tourism Centre. And talk of subsidising industries, there's never been an industry that's been subsidised into success. These are areas which, for historic reasons, Indigenous populations have been located.
What about health and medical research in Australia? That's been subsidised to huge success. Go and look at McEwen's report in terms of the social return on investment in health in Australia. It's incredible. The problem is, all the Labor Party's done is subsidise these sinking ships and these sunset industries as opposed to sunrise. McEwen's, out there and showing just how much we got out of health and medical research in terms of return on jobs.
Judith, I might let you
well, you're not going to get that health and research centres in the Mossman Gorge. You're dreaming. You're dreaming. It's just unrealistic.
Your views about what Mark Carnegie in particular was saying in relation to...
Look, I think there is a broader point, and that is this, that actually Australia does a pretty good job in using the transfer system to distribute money, right? So if you look at Australia by comparison with a lot of other countries, we give very little to the top in terms of transfers, and we do distribute a lot to lower income earners. But I guess it's picking up, and I really hate to feel that I might have agreed with Mark Latham on another point, but this is not just about money. It really is not just about money. And in fact, it's partly actually with the way the money is structured that, there is a withdrawal of benefits, there's a withdrawal of net income when people work more. And that is, I think, a real problem for people because they sort of make that comparison. But one of the things that really worries me is the sort of what I call the intergenerational transmission of disadvantage, that seeing your parents get up in the morning and get organised and get off to work and the like, that it's not necessarily about money. That's sort of providing a role model for children. A lot of these children are being brought up in environments where, there is really a high degree of idleness. I did live in Adelaide for many years. I remembered that there was a program where in the northern schools, in the northern suburbs, they introduced a breakfast program. Now, it turned out that a lot of the children were going to school without breakfast and the teachers were worried, and I can understand that. But it's interesting that the Salvation Army at the time was very opposed to this because their point was this, that to the extent that the government or outside agencies take on the responsibility of parents, those parents will withdraw from those areas, and it basically is a sort of slippery slide. So I'm really I don't know what the answer is. I think, clearly there are kids that manage to escape and good schools, I think, probably is part of the solution. Interesting enough, the research shows, and this is your point, the other Mark, which is that truancy for children from disadvantaged backgrounds really has a very negative impact on their school performance. For, rich people like you, Mark, you can take your kids off skiing and it doesn't matter much, but, for children from disadvantaged background, the more they miss school, the disproportionate decline in their school performance. So, but then that kind of is difficult. So what, you employ truancy officers who go around and knock on people's doors. So I think there is this kind of essential conflict between us kind of understanding some of the problems, but kind of feeling too sort of liberal to want to interfere, so I think we're kind of at that stage.
It would be remiss of me in a discussion about the return of the class system not to talk about the political and public debate after this last budget. So we've been hearing about rolled gold paid parental leave schemes and you know, wealthy female lawyers kind of, you know, taking huge amounts of money from the government to have their babies. On the other end, we've been hearing about the transport preferences of poor people. I wanted to ask each of you...
Preference would be quite the right word.
Habits and behaviours. I wanted to ask each of you to reflect on the discussion post the budget and what does it really say about how the politics of class is playing out in politics at the moment. I might start with you, Mark Latham.
Well, I think the problem with the budget is twofold. The broken promises generated a lot of outrage about political distrust and the democratic deficit. But on the substance of the economics, there's a remoteness, an ignorance about the true nature of underclass in Australia, and it's best reflected by Joe Hockey saying that poor people don't own cars. Well, they own older cars, gas guzzlers, and often in the outer suburbs have to drive longer journeys to do X, Y, Z, and there is an impact there when you increase petrol tax. So one of the problems with the entrenched poverty in Australia is that not enough MPs are familiar with the detail of it. And these areas tend to be lost. Their voting power is sort of taken for granted. They're not politically active themselves. They're obviously not in the media. They're not a lobby group.
So their voting power is taken for granted primarily by the Labor Party?
Well, it used to be, yeah. And there's an apathy there about politics where, you know, if you're door knocking through different suburbs, it's a better quality of work to go door knock in the middle class areas where you get a bit more responsiveness than a much harder slog in a public housing estate. But, you know, I remember, when was this, late 90s, I was on the sort of in self-imposed exile on the Labor Party backbench under Kim Beazley, working away on different local projects, and Tony Abbott was the Employment Services Minister. And he came out to look at I got him out there because the Catholic nuns were running a laundry service, and he was drawn to this to offer a bit of government support. And he came to the Claymore public housing estate and said to me, I never knew areas like this existed. Now, to Abbott's credit, he has gone out of his way with Noel Pearson and my project to educate himself. But if you come from that background and represent a seat up Manly there where the biggest issues, you know, how's the surf breaking, then and Mossman and these type of places, well, you're not going to be familiar in your own personal background, your own parliamentary duties with the nature. So the first step is to go out of your way. Abbott has said as Prime Minister he'll serve a week in Indigenous communities. We should have all parliamentarians, if they haven't got these areas in their own electorate, getting out and living a week in a public housing estate or an Indigenous community. Abbott has set a good lead there, and I hope it at least makes people familiar with the problem. And in Joe Hockey's case, get out there and drive a big 85 Valiant around and understand how much petrol it uses.
I mean, I don't think just Indigenous communities. I always used to have a laugh when you used to say you were the boy from Green Valley, and because I'm not from Sydney, I was thinking, that sounds quite nice.
Yeah, it did. Promotional thing, it lured us all out there.
Mark Carnegie,
Then you found out they'd not only taken all the trees down, they'd knocked off all the topsoil for developments elsewhere.
I think you have
There's nothing green about it.
Very strong point. Not that this has by and large been the policy mistake of the Commonwealth Government, but I know these housing estates, and Bob Gregory's done some important research about this, that there's really serious economic and labour market disadvantage clustered around these public housing estates. And I know in Adelaide they used to sort of cunningly locate them away from any public transport network. So if you didn't have a car, you didn't have a chance. So I think a lot of mistakes have been made. But the interesting thing is it's taking a very long time to unwind those kinds of mistakes because, well, certainly in Melbourne, you know, they're not doing anything about the public housing flats, for example. They still exist. And, you know, I don't think they've kind of got with the idea that there is actually a very important geographic dimension to inequality. And as you say, people who live in sort of inner leafy or even trendy suburbs really have no idea what it's like to see that kind of intergenerational entrenchment of disadvantage because they never go there.
Mark Carnegie, back to talking about the budget. One of the critiques of the budget was that it would further entrench inequality as it exists to the extent that it exists in Australia today, and that the burden of the budget was not kind of evenly spread. Your views just generally about the discussion post-budget?
So, I mean, one thing I wanted to say about the budget, and I think it goes to the subject of the conversation today, is you can hear three people very quickly not talking about the return of the class system so much as the emergence of the class, the excluded class. And what I think happened in terms of the response to the budget is that people just don't like, and understandably so, this idea that what was meant to be a political document ended up being virtually a religious document that had at its core this idea that the poor must suffer. That's what just got everybody, which is make them suffer. This is an immensely complicated thing. If you buy the argument of three panellists who I don't feel like anybody thinks are all in a narrow point on the Australian political spectrum, that everyone understands that there are 10 or 15% of people who are the excluded class. And whether it's the right, the centre or the left, the people outside politics understand that trying to find some way to engage that group of people who have been left behind in Australia is absolutely core. And I think what happened was everybody turned around and said, in this society where most of us have done so extraordinarily well over the last 25 or 35 years, just something targeted at, hey, if we just get them to suffer, it'll be okay, is what sent everybody wild.
Yeah. But don't you think, though, in many ways it was, and come on, we've got a debt and deficit problem, even the Labor Party accept that in the medium term, but it was the mixed messaging. I mean,
won't buy that. By the way, we can have a row about that.
I've never been in favour of the paid parental leave scheme. I mean, it's absolutely the dopiest idea that you would spend $5.5 billion on a really select group of women. You know, we're talking about maybe 150,000 women, a lot of whom are pretty well paid already. You'll crowd out employers paying this benefit to probably about 50% of it. Absolute madness, you know. So we need some consistency in philosophy about government spending being directed to those who find it hardest to look after themselves. We don't spend it on senior associates from one of the big law firms.
Right. I might now ask for the house lights to be turned up because there's an opportunity for some questions from the audience. There is a roving, or I think there are standing mics. There's one over there and one over there. And there's also one up there and one up there. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So I will just say number 4 or number 3. No questions. There's always, oh no, here's a few people.
Don't be
so
shy.
where's the first that's hard? Somebody has to break the ice. This young lady at number 1.
Hi. I haven't heard any discussion about the inequalities that are really built into the system. So a friend of mine, for example, works with job seekers. And for agencies trying to help these individuals, there is an incentive to keep these people out of work for more than 2 years because then they get paid more. That's the way the system has been built. What about those kinds of inequalities that are being built into the system? If you're going to talk about an underclass, let's talk about some of the environmental things that are happening to keep these people at an underclass. And I don't see policies addressing those.
Who'd like to respond to that?
You're the labour market expert,
Oh,
Judith,
I see.
aren't you?
I'm the expert. It's fair. I'm the expert.
You are a labour market economist.
I think you're right. I mean, look, I think there are some detail. There is. I mean, you know, sometimes I wish I hadn't become an economist because I think economists are terribly cynical people because we see everything in terms of incentives. And so those people who work in the job providers you know, they tend to be influenced by the incentives that are put to them in terms of the fee structures and the like. So, you know, I hope that there are some good stories about that, but I also think that, you know, it can be pretty tough, I think, for people, and that's why I kind of think we need to sort of think these things through, that, you know, that suggestion, was it Kevin Andrews, please, was we were going to have, oh no, sorry, it was Eric, who suggested that that people apply for 40 jobs per month. I mean, this is just a ridiculous idea. I'd prefer them to apply for 1 or 2 jobs properly and intensively and follow it up, because that's how you get a job, not by applying for 40 jobs. So, you know, I think there's a lot of naivety out there. I mean, we obviously don't want, I mean, it's a horrible term actually, job snob, but I mean, you know, most of us accept that, you know, you don't start off as managing director of BHP, you have to kind of get your foot in the door. But, you know, I think there are some issues about whether the job service provider network works as well as it can.
Any other panellists want to respond to that, or we should move to the next
No, they don't
question?
know anything.
Okay, number 2.
A couple of things, be a bit technical maybe, but the distribution of income is always less skewed than the distribution of capital and wealth. And I would have thought that class has got a lot to do with wealth rather than income. And yes, you're right, we've done a pretty good job at redistribution of income transfers, although I'm not sure, Judith Sloan, that we haven't given the top income through superannuation pretty good transfers.
I was not including tax concessions.
But the main thing is, and we've actually in Australia, I'd agree that we've done okay on the distribution of wealth, partly because, coming back to Piketty's view, we've had fairly good growth rates and haven't followed the European and the rest of the world. But now that the mining boom is over, if you follow Piketty, and the rate of return ends up being greater than the growth rate, we're in for the return of the class system, are we not?
Look, you know, I kind of follow this, probably no one else does, but I think the interesting thing about what you say is how important high rates of employment are and low rates of unemployment are. So what happened with the GFC, it did knock about the wealth of wealthy people, but they seem to have recovered, right? Even overseas they seem to have recovered. But for those societies which have very high rates of unemployment, so in Spain you've got 20% overall unemployment, 50% youth unemployment, quite a lot of other European countries, high unemployment. This is absolutely devastating in terms of outcomes in inequality, welfare, and of course the future for those people and their families. So I think you and I actually probably agree that one of the absolutely critical things is that we have a set of policies that will continue to keep unemployment relatively low. And I think it is a worry. I mean, I'm worried about the emerging youth unemployment issue. And the thing about youth unemployment, I go back to that issue of geography, is that there are some parts of the country, and Mark will know this about Western Sydney, but I certainly know there are parts of Melbourne and parts of northern Adelaide, for example, where the rates of youth unemployment are already very high. And that, I think, is a real worry.
Can I just say, I don't think the class system ever disappeared to then have to return. I think the class system has changed. But on your point about how to best measure it, when Australia had a fairly closed, protected, static economy, you could have your snapshot indicators, you know, your bell curve, your Gini coefficient measurement of income and wealth distribution, and that was a reasonably reliable indicator of equality. But now the economy's open, much more dynamic. I think the best way of looking at the equality question is through mobility. You know, what chance is there of someone in the bottom 50% of society getting into the top 50%? How socially mobile are we? And the best indicator of that is education attainment, because if you get qualifications, you know, you've got the new gold standard behind you, and you're probably going to do well in the modern economy. And in 2012, the OECD did a report on comparative rates of education mobility in its member nations, and Australia ranked 10th out of 27, which is not perfect, but in the first half, 10th out of 27. And the odds of someone whose parents have low levels of education attainment in Australia reaching university were 47%, which was way ahead of New Zealand, 21%, Canada 22%, and the United States 29%. And we're even ahead of 2 Scandinavian countries normally associated with higher levels of egalitarianism, Norway and Finland. So at 47% of the prospects of someone whose parents have got low levels of education, you yourself can go on to university. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And I think that's the best way of looking at equality in Australia, not with a static snapshot of income distribution, but more drilling into these indicators of social mobility, particularly in the education system.
Number 3.
Thank you. My question is really addressed to the issue of the underclass. My perspective is as a general practitioner in the Hunter Valley, where I've dealt with this class of people for some 25 years. I follow on from the point made by another questioner about the chronic disability pension, which is supposed to be reviewed by the disability services every 3 years. It is my impression over 25 years that very few of these patients, whether they've been cured or not, have a review from the public services. The second point is to do with the question earlier about truancy. I trained in Scotland. In Scotland, in Aberdeen, if a school truant this was recognised as a trigger for potential psychiatric illness within families. And not only in the child, but also in the parents and extended family, a sign of social lack of support. It's quite often my experience that children who are not Aboriginal, who are white and do not attend school, there is not an adequate pickup of these patients to come to medical services and to psychiatric services, partly because the school counsellors have nowhere to send them. And still remains an enormous lack of mental health services for children throughout Australia, but certainly in the Hunter Valley. The Hunter Valley is an area very much like described by the panellists. I have truck drivers who earn more than some of the doctors who work in my practice. And yet we have still, in our area, a large underclass of people with the right psychiatric treatment, could be attending school, achieving better educational outcomes, and certainly once they are treated, they often become very reliable and grateful people.
Okay, so sorry, I just need to we're running out of time, so I just was wondering if you could just frame a question, or were you just wanting the panel to respond?
My point is that social policy should not just be about social policy, the recognition that so-called social problems should be recognised as wider medical problems, and all stakeholders should be allowed the opportunity to recognise the solutions that can be available and to use other government departments to actually have input and to have these problems fixed.
Any response from the panel? Mark Carnegie, did you have something to say?
No, I mean, I'm back to this point, which is what are we doing in terms of health and safety in the booming mining sector, the amount of money we spend on that compared to the amount of money we spend on mental health when suicide is a bigger killer than health and safety.
Yeah.
But I mean, on that point about disability support pensioners, I mean, we know from research, we know that basically very few people ever get off the disability support pension. They either move on to the age pension or die. And the thing is that, you know, we were talking about incentives. The thing is, people, I think, notwithstanding what I think is a terrifically good logo for the Labor Party, the dignity of work, people understand that, but they're very fearful of going off the DSP because otherwise they may drop back to the very low form of New Start and lose other benefits. So I feel, I think there is an important discussion about the trap of welfare dependence, and you see that in the Aboriginal communities too, and we just have to be brave enough to have that discussion.
I'm going to go to question 4. I would ask, we've only got a couple of minutes, so please do make it a kind of a neat, concise question so we can get through as many as possible. Number 4.
My concern is the returning inequality and the growth of the richer portion of Australia based on the resource industry and the exportation of our natural assets without value adding to them. At the moment, I'm a geologist, and I know these assets won't last forever, and I worry that, so rather than the class system and the inequality right now, what about in the future, and how we're actually using these to build capital and to build systems, build infrastructure, public service things that'll grow diminish inequality in the future. So Joe Hockey likes to talk about growing the pie, but I worry about when the flour runs out, what are we going to eat? So
cake.
My question...
We're going to eat cake.
No, but you need...
Mark Honey,
Mark Honey,
I'd like you to get to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got a really good point, which is it's another thing. These assets are national assets. The idea that you can peg them, drill 3 holes in the ground, and 97% of the economic rents go to you and only 3% goes to the nation, other than spillovers and trickle-down effect. Why can't we have a national debate upon that? I have no idea. Why is it that the mining tax was so extraordinarily easy for what was only 20 million bucks, and they bought the election on the strength of turning that away, and yet nobody can make the case that the mining tax wasn't a rational tax to levy on behalf of the nation. So I think you're absolutely right. Why it is that voters love that, axe the tax, it's beyond me.
Judith, do you have a quick response to that?
Well, look, I think the broad point is we have to make sure, as the mining boom fades, what is going to be the diversification of the Australian economy, which will continue to generate the jobs and the incomes, and that is also an important debate. I don't agree with you about the mining tax. It was an appallingly designed tax anyway, but maybe we should
we'll have
return
a fight
to
about
the
it
debate.
later.
Yeah, we can have it backstage.
So I've got, unfortunately, only 30 seconds, so I'm just going to go to number 1. I apologise to the people who've been standing, but if you go and buy the books in the signing, you can ask your questions. But number 1.
Okay, I'll make it quick. I'll direct my question to Mark Carnegie. You suggested that there is a, amazing number of jobs out there waiting to be created. If you lower these regulations that clutter innovations, my understanding is that a lot of these regulations do exist for reasons, and they probably, could have prevented environmental disasters that some of which I can see in parts of America. So where's your red line? What are some of the regulations that you think should be get rid of, so to speak?
Yeah, Mark.
So if we can just, 2 different things, environmental regulation or health and safety regulation. And do you want 1 level of environmental regulation or 2? Or what are you going to do in terms of how to find some way to not delay these projects in a situation where there is a foot race internationally? I'm very happy to have whatever environmental regulations the nation wants in terms of protections, but they need to find some way where it's one shot, quick cycle, so that what you don't do in every situation on the environmental thing is just be in a situation where we're short nickel, there's 3 projects in Australia, there's 30 around the world, we don't have the debate as a one shot, do we want to bring on some nickel capacity or do we want it to go somewhere else in the world? The whole thing about the mining boom is that ended up being a situation where just for a whole series of reasons, very, very quickly, we ended up being able to capture the LNG opportunity. We would have no chance competing in that industry against the Americans at the moment. A whole lot of people in the audience will absolutely hate that, but the truth is a huge amount of Australian GDP for the next 20 years will come just through happenstance and just through the fact that that particular thing went through a narrow economic window. The second point is, as sure as I'm sitting here, the health and safety regulation is absolutely metastatic. When you look at any of what that does to slow processes down compared to actually what it was meant to do at the beginning, which was stop a whole lot of 18 to 30-year-old guys running people over or taking pieces of industrial machinery and killing people with them, which was completely and utterly sane. But the idea that you're paying somebody $180,000 to open the lunchroom and shut the lunchroom on building sites across Australia because of the health and safety occurring that they might boil themselves, with the thing they boil tea with, or the toaster, you think that's sane?
I'd like you to continue to clap and thank our panellists for this afternoon. Judith Sloan, Mark Carnegie, Mark Latham.